Hello, what is up, guys? Welcome back to PS Platypus and welcome back to another semester. Last semester of pre-clin. Yep. So we'll be starting off with the reproductive system. And today's physiology. So we'll be talking about the ovarian and the menstrual cycles. Now, look, this can be a pretty complicated topic. It took me a while to wrap my head around it, but I think if you break it down step by step and understand the interactions between the different cycles, it really helps to have that broad overview. So this is a broad overview. You can come back to this. We're starting off step by step, but overall you have three main cycles. You have the ovarian cycle, which is the changes that are happening in the actual follicle within the ovaries. So the development of the ovum from primordial to primary follicle, etc. And then you have ovulation, and then what happens after is with the formation of the corpus luteum and degeneration. So that's the ovarian cycle. The uterine cycle is just the physical changes that are happening in the uterus and the endometrium, which grow and like sort of wax and wane and essentially lead to the menstruation. The third cycle is the hormonal changes that are occurring every month that sort of dictate that, yeah, pretty much dictate the ovarian and the uterine cycle. And there's a bit of back and forth with the ovarian and the hormonal cycle, which I sort of was covered in endocrine as well, but we'll go into it now. Okay, so the ovarian cycle definition is sort of these cyclical changes that are happening within the ovary, where you have maturation of the follicle. It grows through all these steps, and then the ovum is shed or ovulated, and then the corpus luteum develops and degenerates. You have two phases. You have the follicular phase, and then ovulation happens, and then you have the luteal phase. Now, what's important to note here is for teaching purposes in textbooks and stuff, it always refers to this as a perfect 28 days regular cycle. Of course, that isn't the case, and everyone's different, and everyone has a huge variation in the length of their ovarian cycle, and that depends on a huge variety of factors. But what's important to note here is that the time from after ovulation to menstruation, or the luteal phase, is what's constant. It's 14 days. The variation in cycle length actually comes from the follicular phase. So someone has a regular 28-day cycle, they have 14 days follicular phase, 14 days luteal phase. Someone has a 32-day cycle, they'll have a 14-day luteal phase, but an 18-day follicular phase. Someone has a 24-day cycle, still a 14-day luteal phase. What's happening? Sorry, just went back. A 14-day luteal phase, and then a 10-day follicular phase. So after ovulation, it'll always be 14 days. The variation comes from the follicular phase. Cool. Here's another thing that can be kind of confusing is when we talk about the menstrual cycle, that's happening every month, and the whole cycle is occurring within a month. Changes in the endometrium. The ovarian cycle, this whole process actually takes over 6 months. And the whole process going from a primordial follicle to a mature follicle doesn't coincide with the actual menstrual cycle. So the primordial follicle, there's heaps of primordial follicles that are always there, and they sort of mature over time into multiple preantral and early antral follicles that are there waiting and are ready to mature. And that's what happens at the beginning of the month. Okay, but what's important to know is each of these steps, like the order they occur in, and then just defining characteristics of all of them. So we start off with the most basic one, the primordial follicle. Okay, you have heaps of these that are always there from puberty to menopause. You have oocytes, you have a single oocyte, and then a single layer or simple squamous layer of cells. Okay, so remember simple and stratified, and then columnar, squamous, cuboidal. So you have simple squamous layer of cells. Then you move on to the primary follicle. It grows, it develops, you have a bigger oocyte, and the squamous cells now become cuboidal cells. Still one layer, still simple, but it's now cuboidal. And then you have the formation of the zona pellucida, which is this layer. It has to do with fertilization, I think, where the sperm enters and attaches. Yeah, that's in the other lecture. And then the primary follicle then moves on to preantral follicle. Now, again, the granulosa stromal cells change, but they change in layers now. So it goes from simple to stratified, still cuboidal. So simple squamous, then simple cuboidal, then stratified cuboidal. Okay. The other thing that occurs here is the formation of thecal cells. What are thecal cells? They're this outer layer of cells that form from connective tissue, and they function alongside the granulosa cells to produce estrogen. How they work together? So from the anterior pituitary, you have LH and FSH that are coming down. These are your gonadotropins. Yeah. LH acts on the thecal cells, and FSH acts on the granulosa cells. So when LH acts on the thecal cells, it produces these androgens. These androgens then go from the thecal cells to the granulosa cells, where with FSH, it turns those androgens into estrogen through aromatase. Cool. So that's just this diagram. Okay, moving on from the early pre-antral follicle. So that's before the antrum. Now we have early antral follicle, and it's in the name. So you have these formation of antrums, which are small fluid-filled spaces that are forming in the follicle. And this is a stage at which you have sort of 10, 20, 25 of these ready at each menstrual cycle, but only one of them continue through this whole stage of maturation and continues as the dominant follicle to become, to mature. And that depends on the amount of estrogen it's producing. And there's like a little dip in the hormonal support, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. And if it survives that, it continues on. When it continues on, it goes and progresses into this, which is a mature or Graafian follicle. What occurs here, defining characteristics again, your primary oocyte completes its first meiotic division and becomes a secondary oocyte. So remember the meiosis tree? This is the first division. And then this little actual oocyte that now is surrounded by this huge antrum, because these small fluid-filled spaces actually combine to become one big antrum. It separates and it floats around this cumulus ophorus, and it's connected by the corona radiata, which I believe are just granulosa cells surrounding this oocyte now. Okay, then what happens is from the mature follicle, ovulation occurs based on the LH surge, which is in the hormonal cycle later. And this oocyte is now out into the fallopian tubes and the uterus and stuff. And what we're left with is a corpus luteum, which is just the rest of the stuff. What is it? It's made up of luteal cells and thecal cells, essentially forms as fibrous clot, and it just secretes a lot of progesterone. The whole point of the corpus luteum is if that ovulated ovum that's now in the fallopian tubes actually gets fertilized by sperm and an embryo forms, it needs to secrete hormones. The corpus luteum secretes hormones to support that embryo and create a... I didn't get that. Could you try again? Sorry, that's Siri. The whole point of the corpus luteum is to support the embryo and create an environment within the uterus to support that embryo by secreting progesterone. If there's no fertilization, it degenerates in 10 days and forms the corpus albicans, which is just fibrous tissue, pretty useless, and eventually gets resorbed by the ovary. Okay, that was the ovarian cycle, follicular and luteal phase, pre and post ovulation. Now we'll talk about the hormonal cycle. Now this is, I know it's a really complicated diagram, but trust me, we'll just go step by step, it'll be okay. From endocrinology, last sem, you remember there's hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, which releases hormones, and they act on distant hormonal organs, right? Distant endocrine organs. So in this case, you have gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, which is released from the hypothalamus. It goes to the anterior pituitary, and depending on the pulsations, releases FSH and LH. Where do LH and FSH go? We talked about this earlier. LH goes to the thecal cells in the follicle, and FSH goes to the granulosa cells. Function, the LH on the thecal cells produce androgens. The FSH has a bit more functions. It has essentially develops the antral follicles, it multiplies the granulosa cells, and it converts those androgens from the thecal cells over here, and takes those androgens and converts them to estrogen via aromatase. Okay. Now, LH-FSH is growing all these antral follicles, and so there's a little bit of estrogen that's being produced, and that has a negative feedback loop. And so there's a negative feedback loop on the LH and FSH because of the estrogen that's being formed by the follicle. That negative feedback there's a slight drop in FSH, and out of those 10, 20, 25 early antral follicles, only one survives that drop in FSH, and that's the dominant follicle that goes on to mature. Now, estrogen's quite unique in endocrinology because when that dominant follicle now is the only follicle that remains, the rest of the antral follicles have now degenerated. It's receiving all of that LH and FSH, and it ramps up the estrogen production. And when there's a lot of estrogen production, that negative feedback loop changes into a positive feedback loop. And so more estrogen is being made, goes up, more LH and FSH, more estrogen is being made, more LH, FSH, and so on and so on. And this causes a huge surge in LH. When that huge surge in LH occurs, that is the direct cause of ovulation. And a bunch of different things happen that lead to ovulation. So we talked about the primary oocyte completing its first meiotic division, that antrum size increases, there's blood flow, nutrients coming out, and then the granulosa cells apparently release these enzymes and prostaglandins that, where are we? We're around here, right? So the follicle and the ovary, there's two membranes separating it that's preventing the ovulation of the ovum into the fallopian tubes. So apparently these enzymes break down these membranes so that the cumulus ovoris can be released. And then the granulosa cells sort of switch over to producing more progesterone, because progesterone is the hormone that's more for like supporting an embryo and supporting pregnancy and growth, and decreases the production of estrogen. Yeah, and then the ruptured follicle then turns to the corpus luteum, which now you have the luteal phase. So you have a big increase in progesterone and a bit of estrogen by the corpus luteum. You have negative feedback to LH and FSH. And there's also inhibin that's released, apparently, that decreases FSH. But essentially, that decrease in LH, FSH is important because now we're thinking about fertilization and an embryo being formed, and you want to prevent development of more follicles and more LH surges and more ovulation happening. So that's the back to the negative feedback loop. If there's no fertilization, the corpus luteum then degrades, and there's a decrease because that was providing the hormonal support. And so there's a decrease in plasma, progesterone, and estrogen, and then we restart back at the follicular phase. So this is the overall summary. So the follicular phase, the build-up, the peak, the LH surge, causing ovulation, luteal phase. You can go through this in your own time. Okay, that's 2 cycles done. You can see the sort of correlation between the ovarian and the hormonal cycle and how they work hand in hand. And now I find this an easier cycle to understand, but at the same time, there's a uterine and a menstrual cycle happening. And I think broadly, you need to think of this, the way I like to think of this, that helps a lot, is to think of the function of the uterus at this point in time with the ovary, is if the ovum is fertilized and an embryo is created, the point of the uterus is to provide support to that embryo and create the optimal environment for first that ovary to be fertilized, and if it's fertilized, to get the nutrients that are required. Okay, but essentially the uterine cycle is, again, cyclical changes that are happening in the endometrium. You have 3 major phases. It starts off with the beginning of menstruation, so the menstrual phase, around 4 to 5 days. Then the menstrual phase, the endometrium has sort of shed off, and then it needs to build back up. So it needs to proliferate, and you have the proliferative phase, and then you have the secretory phase. And basic anatomy to go through, you have the stratum functionalis and the stratum basalis in the uterus, in the endometrium. The stratum functionalis, in its name, is the functional part of it. It responds to the ovarian hormones. It has columnar epithelium. It has glands. It has arteries, especially these spiral coiled arteries that are providing the blood flow to all of this. And then you have the stratum basalis, which is at the bottom. It's not functional. It doesn't respond to ovarian hormones, so it doesn't change at all throughout the cycle, because the only thing that's changing are the ovarian hormones. So if it's not responding, it stays the same. And it's the same type of cells, it's just more compact. Cool. Start off at the beginning of menstruation. The menstrual phase is essentially the shedding of the stratum functionalis. Around 30 to 40 mils of blood loss. It can go up to 60 mils where it's not abnormal. But think of what's happening at the end of the luteal phase, at the end of the ovarian cycle, is you have the corpus luteum. We're assuming fertilization hasn't happened. It's turned into corpus albicans. It's degenerating. So there's a decrease in the hormonal support. There's decrease in the hormones that are being released. And in response to this decrease in hormones, the endometrium and the cells of the endometrium produce prostaglandins. And what these prostaglandins do is the arteries, the spiral arterioles that I pointed out before, it causes this mass vasoconstriction of the spiral arterioles. Of course, that's the blood flow to the columnar cells of the endometrium. So if they vasoconstrict due to spasm, there's going to be ischemia and those cells are going to die. Those prostaglandins also cause uterine contractions of the muscle layer. The spiral arterioles, after that massive vasoconstriction and spasm, then dilate. And of course, their capillaries, they're like arterioles, they're not that strong. So then all the blood hemorrhages through these weakened walls and the stratum functionalis is shed off. Cool. Now we've lost the stratum functionalis after menstruation and we need to build it back up. Proliferation, it's growing. Now at this point in time, we're getting a lot of hormones that are being released because, especially estrogen, because the dominant follicle is growing and is developing. So estrogen is the main thing that's supporting this whole this stage of the cycle. And so you have proliferation of the epithelial cells, you have blood vessels are enlarging the glands and the stroma. And at this point in time, what is the function of the endometrium and the uterus at this point is to allow, if fertilization needs to occur, it needs to allow sperm to enter. So when the ovum is ovulated, sperm can fertilize it. So it actually thins the cervical mucus at this stage. So that can allow the sperm to pass into the uterus easier. It's like easily. And then this phase ends with ovulation. In histology is also pretty important to know for this part, but when you look at it, you have a slightly smaller stratum functionalis, so basalis at the bottom, and then you can see this sort of line of demarcation. Then you have functionalis, and you have long, straight glands. There's no zigzag pattern, which we'll see next. There's no secretory products, just long, straight glands going up and down. Cool. Ovulation's occurred, the proliferative phase is finished, and we have a corpus luteum secreting lots of progesterone in the ovarian cycle, and we move on to secretory phase of the endometrium. Now again, think of what's the function at this point. The ovum has been ovulated. If sperm has come in and is fertilized, then an embryo is going to form. And at this point, the main priority is to make the optimal, create an optimal environment for that fertilized embryo to implant and grow. Okay? So what do we need for that? We want glands and stroma to enlarge. We want arteries to grow, elongate, provide blood flow, and provide nutrition. So glycogen, glycoproteins are secreted to support that embryo. It's driven by progesterone because now in the ovary, the ovulations occur, there's just the corpus luteum left. So it's driven, which is releasing progesterone. Now, what's the priority? To create the optimal environment. So we want to thicken the cervical mucus now, because you want to create a barrier to the outside world. You don't want more sperm entering. You don't want bacteria to enter if there's an embryo growing in there. All right. And then you also don't want the myometrium, the muscle layer, to contract. So you inhibit those prostaglandin-induced contractions. So thickening of the cervical mucus and inhibition of the contractions. So before the ovulation, it's more so letting the sperm in. You have thin cervical mucus. You don't want too much of a barrier. And then after ovulation, what if an embryo is formed? You want to create the optimal environment, so you thicken the cervical mucus and inhibit the contractions. It's a lot easier to think of it in what's the function and then what's happening. Okay, now most 9 times out of 10 fertilization is not going to occur, and then the corpus luteum is going to degenerate into the corpus albicans. So there's going to be a decrease in the amount of progesterone, and that then, if you remember at the beginning, there's that decrease in progesterone, which leads to the vasoconstriction and the spasm of arteries, and then the dilation and blood hemorrhages out, and the menses begin again. Okay, cool. Oh yeah, and histology. Okay, at this point, you don't have those nice long straight glands. They're sawtooth glands, so zigzag almost. You can definitely see those here quite clearly and coiled. And then there's secretory products. Remember, all those glycogens and glycoproteins and all those nutrients are being released. And then clearly the endometrium will also be thicker. So you have the stratum bassalis and stratum functionalis. Like you'll see the difference between this stratum functionalis, which is a lot smaller because it's still proliferating, and this massive stratum functionalis. Cool, that's all I've got. Yeah, let me know if any questions, comment them down below or at our Q&A sessions. I know it's a complex topic, but I think just understanding what's happening, and then you can memorize a little bit of the details, but understanding what the main function and just seeing how the cycles sort of correlate. So take a phase of the cycle and think, what's happening in the other cycle? So it's a secretory phase. What's happening in the ovarian cycle at this point, right? There's a lot of progesterone, so it's after the ovulation. So there's the corpus luteum and the corpus albicans. So think of it that way and understand the connection between the two. And I think you should be all good. Cool. See you guys.